Bell goes off. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Morning again. I will share again that I am Barb Sorum. I am one of the regional directors of prevention initiatives with Family Wise Services. I have all of southern Minnesota, so about 38 counties. So nice to see some familiar faces this morning. And I'm coming to you from Freeborn County. It's where I live in office. So you are joining the breakout session, Fostering Individual and Collective Healing Across the Generations with SUZANNE KOEPPLINGER. We're so excited that we have SUZANNE for the next hour, and just really exciting to hear what you have to share. So with that, I think I will turn it right over to SUZANNE. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barb. And thanks to all of you for joining today from wherever you may be. Just a brief introduction, because there's so much I want to share, and an hour we'll get started. But briefly, some of you I know, I see a few familiar names coming in. For 10 years, I was the executive director at the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. And during those 10 years, I felt very proud of the work that we all did together, particularly the work to recognize the role of historic trauma in the sexual exploitation of our women and children. That particular project, the Shattered Hearts Report and understanding what was happening, really revealed the deep historic, collective, individual, and vicarious trauma that most of my staff and I were all dealing with. And so we sought ways to move forward with healing-centered frameworks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But for the last 8 years, I led an initiative, first at the George Family Foundation, then at the Minneapolis Foundation, Catalyst Initiative, investing in culturally meaningful healing practices in community. And a lot of great work has come up, particularly in Indian country. The mind-body medicine in Indian country work has been very robust. And now I'm a consultant, and I'm trying to get philanthropy and government to invest more in culturally meaningful healing practices in community as part of a continuum of a mental health care system, right? The true primary prevention. How are we helping people move through their pain, whether it's spiritual pain, physical pain, emotional pain, using the practices that have meaning to them, the language that has meaning to them, and fund it. So that's a lot of the work that I'm doing now. First slide, please. There's some objectives to this 1 hour together. I'm going to present some concepts, some theoretical concepts, some shared language, how this historic collective trauma impacts leadership and relationship, how our own self-awareness and healing practices can interrupt that intergenerational transmission of wounds. I'll do some very brief instruction, invite you to practice some ways that can help you settle your central nervous system, reach a more strategic thinking frame, and really foster passion. And then just a little bit about how our own wholeness affects our relationships and what is the impact on a healing justice movement. Next slide, please. But first, I would invite you all, what brings you joy? Let's start there. If you would, drop it into the chat. What brings you joy? Your children, your pets, being in nature, good food, whatever it may be. Just drop it in, because when we start to put our minds to the joyful, it actually releases serotonin and other wonderful happy chemicals in our brain that make us feel better. So sunshine and laughing, I'm seeing some wonderful things here. Bird watching, all littles, yes, yes. Sunshine and playing in the dirt, nature, puppies, singing, gardening, yeah. So I encourage you, whenever you feel the need, to just go there. Go to what brings you joy. I'm watching these come in. Fresh air, drawing, painting, art. Art is so important, right? Gardening, getting our hands in the dirt. Thank you so much. Keep those coming. We're going to continue to move through the presentation. Next slide, please. And I really appreciated Barb grounding us at the very beginning of the session early this morning. And I'm going to offer that as another opportunity now. I always like to begin any session with some breath. So if you are comfortable, if you're seated, particularly if you're seated, I would invite you to think about your dignity, your dignified spine, sitting up straight and tall with your full presence. Imagine there's a string at the very top of your head, and it's gently pulling you up. Feet on the floor, relaxing, chair is holding you up. If you're standing, that's fine too. The ground has you. If you're standing, don't lock your knees, just have a slight bend to your knees. Notice your shoulders. Where are your shoulders? We spend a lot of time on the computer or worried or writing, and so we round in. Now I invite you to round back. Think about dropping your shoulder blades into your back pockets, if you had back pockets. Round them back. And what this does is it opens up our chest. We have a more open stance to the world, and we increase the oxygen that we bring into our system. So as you're sitting there, again, Barb, thank you for setting the tone. Notice your breath. If you'd like to close your eyes, please do. If you're not comfortable, just lower your gaze and soften your gaze so that you're not really looking at a thing. And just begin to notice where your breath is. And if you can, draw that breath down into your low belly. We often breathe up high in our chest without really being aware of it. And as you'll hear as we get into this presentation, that's actually where our survival breath is. And so it's important to begin to develop good discipline and practices around grounding your breath in your low belly. Breathing in low and slow. You can even put your hand on your belly. As you inhale, your low belly, I'm talking about below your belly button, should expand. And as you exhale, it can collapse just a little bit. Breathing in, low and slow, into your belly, and out through your mouth. And as you do this, notice if your shoulders can relax just a little bit more. Notice any pain points you have. Is your neck a little creaky? You can rotate your head just a little bit. Breathe into those points that feel a little sore. Your low back, maybe your hips. Just use your breath to ground and be fully present in this moment. There's nothing else you need to do at this moment other than breathe. Okay, thank you. And as you're comfortable, just come back into the room. But your breath, again, I think, Barb, you said something beautiful. I wrote it down. Self-healing, well, you said something beautiful about our own resilience is grounded in our breath. I wrote it down. I won't take the time to find it. Yeah. So next slide, please. You can also think about starting your meetings, any staff meetings you have, with a few moments of a grounding breath. That's a good organizational practice. Trauma, something we all know, and we know a lot about it. So back when I was at the Indian Women's Resource Center was sort of the emergence of this framework of trauma-informed. And we all had to have trauma-informed training, and that was really important. But in my opinion, it is insufficient. To be informed is really important. But what happened was it became a check the box activity for many people, and it often didn't actually change the way they were helping people heal. So screening people for trauma inappropriately was taking place. Sometimes screening people for trauma very appropriately was taking place. But our capacity to know what to do now is really restricted by how many resources we have, what we know about healing practices, whether the clinical mental health care system is the place that people will go or should go. So I'm in a place now where I'm talking about shifting this dialogue, and I'll get there in a minute. But as you all know, SAMHSA identifies trauma as the thing that happens to an individual. And yes, it does. And it is not just the individual who is wounded, right? We all know that. The collective and historic trauma frameworks are not really part of the clinical models as they are right now, with some exceptions. And so it's very important as we're doing our work that we understand that, yes, it's individual, but it is also collective. Next slide, please. Vicarious trauma, I'm sure you all know exactly what this is, right? If you're doing the hard work, if you're working with people who have trauma in their lives every day, it's very possible that you will be physically, spiritually, and emotionally impacted by it. The transmission of the wounds can actually be absorbed into our skin. And so having good self-care practices, having the capacity to differentiate between compassion and empathy is really important. If I am empathetic, I feel your pain. If I'm compassionate, I offer you loving kindness. If I'm feeling everyone's pain all day long, I really need to have good detoxing practices at the end of each session or at the end of each day to make sure that I'm not carrying all that in my cells. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of toxic stress in our lives, the political environment, racial justice, COVID, layered on microaggressions, racism, layered onto all these collective historic, like complex traumas. So we're all carrying stress around on some level. And for many people, it's manageable. We either have really good management skills around that, or we're fortunate enough to have tolerable stress in our lives. But for a lot of folks, it becomes habitual, and I'll talk a little bit about habits. It becomes habitual to stuff it, ignore it, plow through it, right? Please know it will come out. It will come out. It must come out. Physically, we just cannot hold that. And so when we're not paying attention to our stress levels, it'll show up in our bodies, of course, but it'll also come out to those closest to us or anonymously. And the examples I think of a lot are social media and road rage. And to those closest to us, right, it's yelling at your kids or getting into ridiculous arguments with your partner. So noticing when your stress is showing up in really unfortunate ways is a really good place to start. Because if you're chronically carrying this much stress and then something happens and you go, you can reset, but you're still going to reset at a high level. So getting your normal barometer down into a very manageable place is a really good goal. Next slide, please. And you all know about ACEs, but I put this slide in because I think it's important to understand the capacity to make healthy decisions as an adult component of ACEs, right? That goes into organizational dysfunction. It shows up whenever there's a conversation about organizational change, or we're gonna, tackle the systems. So making good decisions as an adult, and we heard Jerry and Wendell talk about this today when you're working with adults. There is a component of ACEs that we need to consider as we're doing our own healing work. Next slide. Guy named Sean Ginwright, who I'm a huge fan of, he's out at San Francisco State University. And he says, and I agree with him, that trauma-informed care has been so important, but it refers to this set of principles that guide and direct how we view the impact of severe harm on our overall health. But it runs the risk of focusing on the pathology, like what's wrong with you, instead of the possibility of well-being, fostering the dreams and the hopes. And one of the young men that Dr. Ginwright writes about talks about, I am not my trauma. That is not my identity. I am full of dreams and possibilities and skills and gifts. Yeah, some bad stuff happened to me. And so it's really important for us to think about how we're reframing trauma-informed as healing-centered, understanding that knowing the trauma, understanding the impact of trauma, that's really important. But now let's add on, what are we doing about the healing? Next slide, please. And Sean Ginwright, I just recommend, he has a new book out called The 4 Pivots. He just has a very interesting way of expressing the frame around healing-centered engagement, which goes beyond just identifying and viewing trauma as an individual experience, understands that it is a collective experience, and then requires a collective healing approach. And it is an asset-driven approach that really helps us center culture at the very core of our well-being. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the human central nervous system 101. Our human bodies, our human central nervous systems were designed to keep us alive, and they've done a really good job of it. So our far ancestors who were hunter-gatherers or who were, hunting primarily for their food, walking through the forest or through the plains, I couldn't find the saber-toothed tiger, but if they came upon an animal, a predator, their immediate response is going to be their survival brain is going to kick in. And a lot of you know about this, the amygdala. It's our survival brain, a little part of our brain back here that kicks in, floods us with lots of hormones. We'll talk about those, but it leads to fight, flight, or freeze responses. Some variation of fight, flight, or freeze is going to be what we do. Those are our choices, and those are really good choices, because if I need to fight this guy, or I need to run like hell to get away from this guy, or I need to hunker down and freeze and hope he doesn't see me, like my body is now going to have a whole bunch of activities taking place that will help me do that. Super important to stay alive. Unless you are looking for this guy every day. Like if you expect the threat every day, if it's part of your awareness all the time, you're probably spending a lot of time in your survival brain, which means you're probably spending a lot of time with fight, flight, or freeze behaviors, which limit your choices. Next slide, please. So this is what happens in our bodies when we perceive the threat or actually encounter a threat. And the threat can be a physical threat. It can be a threat to our values. We may feel like we're not being respected. We may feel like there's a danger to our well-being in some way. So it doesn't have to be a physical, in-your-face kind of threat. It can be very subtle. But when we perceive that, this is what happens in our body. The hormones react and they flood our systems. Our whole body gets engaged. Our eyes will dilate. Our breath gets high in our chest. Our blood flow is restricted to the limbs. And really, it's so practical, because that if I'm going to fight that tiger, if there's reduced blood flow to my limbs, I'm not as likely to bleed to death if he cuts me. So it's very practical survival stuff. Our digestive system stops working. So very important link between our digestive system and trauma or stress. And it adds inflammation and reduces our immune functions. Next slide, please. Cortisol is one of the primary stress hormones. So your body's going to be flooded with cortisol, whether you actually encounter the threat or you just think the threat might be there. That's anxiety, right? Your body is still getting the same messages. It's still producing cortisol at abnormally high levels. If that happens over a period of time, your body starts to think of it as normal. And so you're going to be chronically producing these high levels of cortisol, which are immune system suppressants and inflammatory agent in your system. And if you think about the link with chronic disease, particularly in Indian country, inflammatory diseases are endemic, right? So there's a direct link, I think, between the trauma, the toxic stress, and the physical health outcomes, particular to how are we managing our stress. And it can be so much damage to our system, as you can see on this slide. Next slide, please. So we hear a lot about self-care. We hear a lot about how we should be doing things differently and managing our stress. So why don't we? Next slide, please. Most of you know about triggers, and I will also say reminders, because there's some awareness now that the word trigger is really a violent word, and maybe we should move away from that. We know what it means. It's a reminder of a past wound, and it's usually a highly emotional response. So that limbic system, that's our survival brain, it will hijack you. When your limbic system or your survival brain is in control, you cannot access your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that does all the creative problem solving, that has all the compassion, the non-judgmental aspects. You can't get there. If you're in amygdala or limbic system, your choices are limited. So a really quick example of what this looked like. When I was at MIWRC, and our beautiful elder, Linda Eaglespeaker, was running all of the sexual violence programs, including our trafficking work. And she was doing her training as a mind-body medicine faculty person for the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. And one day she had one of her young staff come into the office in a panic. Like, breathing up here, we got it. Like, there was a young girl in my office, and she was frightened because we thought the pimp was outside. The girl has been, horribly abused. The staff member is really up here. I mean, her stress level is up here. Linda, with her wisdom, says, we're just going to sit down for a minute. No, we can't sit. We got to, no, just sit for a minute. We're just going to take some breaths. She did that for 2 minutes. And then she said, okay, now let's problem solve. Right? You cannot think of creative problem solving if you're this jacked up. So the opportunity and the challenge for us is to develop disciplines and practices around not reacting and shifting to a more strategic stance. Next slide, please. If we have developed certain practices or habits along the way that served us well, they can become habitual, and we may not even be aware of them. So habits are unconscious, repetitive actions. They can be influenced by identity. Individuals, organizations, and movements all have them. When I say it can be influenced by identity, I will say that when I came into my role at the Indian Women's Resource Center, I came in as a survivor of domestic violence and rape. I thought I'd done my healing, and I didn't realize until much later that in a leadership role, I carried a lot of habits with me that were not useful to me. They helped keep me alive during all that rough stuff, but they were not useful to me in a leadership role. And one of those habits was whenever a man would be in my office trying to exert control over me, and county contractors were notorious for this, I would lose it. Like I would get my back up, my limbic system would totally engage, I would be so triggered. And even one case, I threw the guy out of my office. Not a strategic move for an executive director who wants that contract, right? So to begin to recognize how we are using old ways of coping with whatever to move through our lives, it's a really important way to begin to shave away the habits. First, you have to notice them. And the way you notice them is through your body, paying attention to your body. For me, I was starting to do my own work around healing those wounds. And I would notice my breath was up here. I would get tight around my neck. My palms would start to sweat. I would start to feel a little bit churny in my gut. And whenever I would notice that, I would just stop. I would just not do anything. Sometimes that meant I would just have to say, I just need a minute. Sometimes it means not responding to the email right away. But I started to notice my habit and what it was tied to. And then I could begin to shave it away. So my identity as a survivor was not helping me. I had to stop being a survivor and become a thriver. Surviving is good. It's insufficient. We have to move to thriving as assertively as we possibly can. Next slide, please. So personal habits. Another habit that I brought into my work was, I can fix it. I can fix him. I can fix people, right? Enabling behaviors, past traumas that we're familiar with, coping skills that we developed along the way that were really useful and kept us alive, but may no longer be serving us well. How our families influenced our decision-making, our relationship with anger, all of that. And the reactive limbic system being in control. So personal habits and how we engage in our leadership, whether that's as a parent or an organizational leader or a community leader or a tribal leader, like these habits are showing up. And go back to that slide. Don't go back to it, but I'm just saying refer back in your mind to that slide on ACEs. And it influences our capacity to make critical decisions today. Next slide, please. Organizations also have habits. And when I say organizations, this can be, tribes can have habits, systems have, government has habits, nonprofits. Philanthropy certainly has a whole lot of habits, mostly dominant culture habits that are often not helpful. But it's important to start to understand habits that your organization may have. These are just some examples. There are supportive organizational habits, but the not so helpful habits, oh, we've always done it this way. We've always submitted our grant proposal 5 minutes before the deadline. We can't do it any other way. Like, what are the habits that you may have in your organization that you can actively identify and start to shave away? Scarcity mindsets, no flexibility, few growth opportunities. And I get that some of this is really informed by the larger system of philanthropy and grants and contracts. But I really think it's important that we push back. Next slide, please. These are more movement habits, but they're sort of larger 50,000-foot level habits to think about. Short-term and incremental thinking is often where we land because it seems more doable. But it's important to know that it takes just as much energy to do big things as it does to do many small things. And incremental thinking is a habit. It can be habitual. Speaking to the choir, not willing to engage. I mean, I have family members that I can't talk to after the 2016 election. Maybe we all understand what that means, but I can't go there. Defining our work by that which we oppose is a really important habit to begin to identify. And I'm seeing a lot of movement strategies that are grounded in dismantling. And I acknowledge that there's a lot that needs to be dismantled, but what I'm really interested in is, what are you creating? What are we creating? How are we choosing our day-to-day activities based on the world we wish to live in and we wish our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to live in, rather than what we're breaking down? So not a lot of time to spend on this, but just food for thought. Next slide, please. So now moving into some practices that can actually help us be regenerative, build more resilience as individuals, as organizations, as movements, making space and time. And I know it's hard, but there is a very important part of this that I'm going to get to in just a moment in terms of healing across the generations, making the space and time for your own inner work is your most important task. To be the warrior for peace and justice, to be the light in the world that the people need you to be, you must be at your best. You must be at your best, to the best of your ability each day. And that really requires making space and time. Eyes on the horizon, very important. Where are we going? What is our purpose? Not just the thing that's in front of us right this moment, but let's keep the big picture in mind and then align our strategies to that. Tending to our wholeness, again, this is a component that we've put off to the side, or we've diminished it, or we've dismissed it because we've got habits and norms that say work 24/7, 16-hour days, 70-hour weeks, because of the urgency of the times that we are in. But if we're burning ourselves out, we're no good to anybody. So tending to our wholeness is critical. Moving with the ready, willing, and open, go big. I already talked about this. Focus, 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 and move quickly and commit to the long path. So on one of the previous slides, there was a habit there about choice avoidance, and we can get really bogged down. Well, do we need consensus? Who's deciding? Like, that can become a process that is habitually just bogging us down. So tending to our wholeness actually, and noticing when we're reacting, can lead to more ease in moving quickly. That's another training. Next slide, please. So healing the connective tissue. If I understand that my ancestors they carry all these wounds, right? The wounding of our ancestors, which is in our DNA, which is in the narrative. If we do not interrupt that, then we will transmit that to the next generations, whether it's our blood kin or all our relatives or the school kids, whoever. So the kuleana, which is my teacher's native Hawaiian, and she calls the kuleana is our sacred responsibility. Our sacred responsibility is to interrupt that transmission. And in order to do that, we have to tend to our wholeness, right? We cannot allow ourselves to be diminished or defined by the noise around us. That takes focus, that takes practice, that takes discipline. So tending to your wholeness means, you never know when you're going to be called upon. When something's going to come up and they're going to say, you know what, we need you. We need you for this thing. And if you're overwhelmed, if you're burning out, if you're irritable and cranky, you cannot be there for them. So tending to your wholeness, even if it doesn't seem to be apparent why right now, is there a big thing I need to get ready for? You just don't know. So be ready. Be as ready as you can be. And lean into it. Don't lean away from the brokenness. Again, that's a shift in our stance. Leaning into the wholeness is a more embracing practice. Leaning away, backing away from the brokenness is actually it's giving in a way. So it's a choice. I'm leaning into the wholeness. Next slide, please. I'm paying attention to the time. Okay. So what are these practices that can help you focus on your wholeness? There are many different ways to do this, and these are just going to be a couple of examples, and then I'm going to invite you to try a few things. Margaret Wheatley, one of my favorite authors, she wrote this book called Who Do We Choose to Be? And she wrote it in 2016, and she made the case then that all of our systems are collapsing. Well, yeah, maybe education, healthcare, governance, all the systems around us are not functioning particularly well. Criminal justice, right? If that is so, who do we choose to be? Who are we in this moment? And what do we choose to do in this moment? And it's an important question. And I ask myself this question almost every day, because in response to any given tragedy, situation, opportunity, I have to keep aligning that with who do I choose to be and what do I choose to bring in to this conversation. Next slide, please. The benefits, and Barb, I think you mentioned this too, there's a lot of good data on meditation. And meditation has, I think some people think it's, I'm going to sit cross-legged and I'm going to have to be really still for hours and hours. Not so. There are many different ways to meditate. I'm going to teach you a quick physical meditation in just a moment. It can be centered prayer. It can be ceremony. It's any time that you get still inside. Focusing on your breath is really important, but becoming still inside. You can do walking meditations to just think about clearing your mind of the clutter, even if it's just for a moment. It does take practice. It doesn't happen overnight. I've been meditating for a dozen years, and I still, sometimes I'm like, whoa, I'm thinking about a lot of stuff here that I don't need to be thinking about right now. It's a practice. It's just like learning a language or getting ready for a marathon. You got to practice. But it has all these benefits. And I will also say, you know, my brother, my Vietnam veteran brother, I love my brother so much, but he carries a lot of those wounds from Vietnam and from our family history. And he has high blood pressure and he doesn't want to take the medication. So I actually convinced him to try some meditation, and he was like, I don't want it. Well, he tried it, and what he would do is he'd take his blood pressure when he would feel agitated, take his blood pressure, and then he'd sit and do his breathing. He'd say, I'm going to do my breathing now. And then he'd take his blood pressure afterwards, and he would see the blood pressure drop, which meant he didn't have to take the medication that he hated to take. So he saw and recognized a physical benefit to just taking 5 minutes when he was feeling agitated, to just breathe, to just settle his breath. Next slide, please. Nutrition is super important. So all the links between you are what you eat, but there are studies that show the link between trans fats and depression. And you know, when we feel blue, we feel low, we feel sad, we want comfort food. We want fry bread and mashed potatoes, and that trans fats, those carbs, those sugars, that's what we crave. And we get an immediate boost, but then what happens is it leads to imbalanced blood sugars, which can lead to feeling tired, moody, poor concentration, and type 2 diabetes, which then we want more trans fats. So paying attention to how you feel when you eat certain foods and experimenting with retraining your taste buds is a really great way to start tending to your wholeness. Next slide, please. Jim Gordon at the Center for Mind Body Medicine has done a lot of this research, and there is clear data that toxic stress and trauma damage the small intestine and interfere with the absorption of nutrients. And we see a lot of people going to their doctors and getting put on medications like omeprazole, which is actually a nutrient blocker. It'll settle the acid, but it's a nutrient blocker, so you're not getting proper nutrients. So functional medicine docs will say, oh, how's your stress level? Are you doing some meditation or some mindfulness practices? Are you paying attention to how you can manage your stress differently? It's really important part of our microbiome, which is the gut bacteria in our gut, and there's more and more evidence that actually the gut is your second brain. The other thing that happens when you do that low and slow breathing, when you do that deep belly breathing, you're stimulating something called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the wandering nerve, and it runs from your brainstem. It touches all your major organs, and then it settles into your digestive tract. And when you breathe low and slow like that, you're telling your vagus nerve, I'm safe, which is giving that message to your brain. So it's often talked about as the rest and digest mode as opposed to the fight or flight mode. So if you're in fight or flight, you're not digesting food well. If you're rest and digest, your digestive system is working because you're getting those messages to your brain. It's safe, you can digest, you can do the work that needs to happen. Next slide, please. Sleep. How many of you get enough sleep on a regular basis? I mean, really restorative sleep, not just, yeah, I got 5 hours, I'm good. Super important to begin to think about preparing for sleep. Prepare for your sleep, prioritize your sleep. It is what makes us able to get up the next day and function really well or not. So you can have a warm bath, read something inspirational or calming, tease, stretching just a little bit, don't do vigorous exercise. The blue light of your electronics actually interrupt your circadian rhythm, so they will keep you awake, particularly if you keep your phone next to you while you're sleeping. And for young people particularly, there's new data out that shows that teenagers who get less than 8 hours of sleep per night are more likely to report depression. So there's a clear link between our ability to rest. And if you're in a place, if you find yourself in a place where you're starting to notice your stress levels, things are happening, and you're feeling particularly vulnerable or fragile, the best thing you can do is rest. Get rest. Drink water. Get rest. Give it time. That's the best way that you can start to move through that and start to heal in a different way. Next slide, please. Movement. It doesn't matter what you do. Pump iron, walk, run, dance. I turn on my music every once in a while. I just dance around my house because no one can see me, and that's a good thing, right? There are many ways to incorporate movement, but the thing is you got to find the thing that you like and that you will do. Stretching is really important. It optimizes your brain. You get more mastery and confidence in your body. You're releasing serotonin into your body. There are also really important movement practices that blend meditation and movement. So you get a kind of twofer. One is Tai Chi, yoga, and there are many different yoga practices. So if you think yoga means I have to fold myself into a pretzel, you can if you want. If you can do that, good on you. But there are also gentle yoga practices that are really much more about grounding you in your breath and keeping your balance strong and keeping your core strong. Next slide, please. So slowing down. Now I would invite you to try a few things with me. Sometimes our bodies just need to slow down. You know, our brains are, we live in our brains quite a lot, and our bodies will start to feel a little stressed. But if you feel that I just can't stop thinking about stuff all the time, I'm just going to share a couple of practices that you can do anytime that may be helpful in just helping you slow down. And the first one is actually a meditative practice. So, you know, for some people, I know that closing your eyes and focusing on your breath is really terrifying. But there are ways to center your breath and clear your mind. You don't have to close your eyes. And I'm going to share one with you right now. I'm just going to step back just a little bit. It's called mountains. That's why I put the picture of the mountain. And what you do if you're standing, or if you'd like to stand up and try this with me now, you want to stand with your feet. Start out with your feet under your hips, but then take one step out. So you have just a little bit more of a wider stance. And again, your shoulders are down and back. And it's a simple movement. You breathe in and bring your arms up, and you're leaning in. So your left knee, I'm leaning into my left knee, is bending just a little bit, and you breathe out. And then you just lean against the right knee and you breathe in and breathe out. And you can do this very slow, You can move it up a little bit. But if you just focus on your breath, trying to not let the noise in your head take over, pay attention to what your body is doing, breathing in and breathing out. And if you do this for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you will actually begin to experience some of the benefits of meditation without having to try to sit and just do that. So that's one practice. The other one is very simple, and I used this a couple weeks ago. I was at the airport standing in line for an hour and a half waiting to check in at Delta, short-staffed. And, oh, I'm gonna miss my flight. So I started to get agitated. I started to feel anxious about I'm gonna miss my flight. And so I just practiced standing on one foot. So if you're standing again, and you can use a chair or a countertop, just stand on one foot, lift up one foot, and try to balance on that foot for as long as you can. And if you have the opportunity to take your shoes off, that's even better, because then you can feel the floor and you can feel how the foot that you're standing on is gripping. What are my toes doing over here? How am I engaging my core? So you're just standing on one foot. And then you go to the other side. And what you do when you do this is you take your mind off your problems for a moment. You're focusing on your body. You're focusing on your breath, because you really need to breathe into this, particularly to breathe low. And you're strengthening your core, because when you do these simple practices, you strengthen your core. And you're improving your balance. So for those of us who are on the aging spectrum, or those of us who are not in great shape, you can improve your balance and hold on to something if it's useful. But these are very simple practices that you can begin to just add to your day whenever you feel like you need to do that. Next slide, please. So Pema Chodron, another one of my favorite authors, but she is a Buddhist nun, and she talks about not causing harm requires staying awake. And part of being awake is slowing down enough to notice what we say and do. The more we witness our emotional chain reactions and understand how they work, the easier it is to refrain from harm. It becomes a way of life to stay awake, slow down, and notice. And again, it may feel counterproductive when you're in a hurry, when you have a lot of deadlines. But I think if you begin to practice different ways of slowing down, focusing on breath, movement, sleep, nutrition, kindness, joy, all of those things, you will see that you are filling up your well. You're full of more to give and are more capable of being the one who is interrupting the transmission of the trauma. Next slide, please. Some recommendations, tips, practices, if you will. Organizations can do everything, but if the individual doesn't do anything, it's marginally effective. Individuals can do everything, but if they go to an organization that is toxic every day, again, it's not optimal. Some people will say, how can we focus on our self-care when we're really faced with trauma every day, trauma upon trauma, structural racism, oppression continues? And I say all that needs to stop, but should we wait for it to stop before we take care of ourselves? I don't think so. I think we're more strongly positioned to be the ones that can take that on if we're not reactive, we're not lashing out, if we are strategic, because we are in our prefrontal cortex, not in our amygdala. But let's not wait for the world to fix itself before we take care of our own wholeness. So individuals, I strongly recommend 10 to 15 minutes a day of spaciousness. Spaciousness. What is that? It can be anything that makes you feel calm, that makes you feel like you're not pressured. I get up early in the morning, I stretch, meditate, read the paper. I have a whole thing in the morning. You can't get me to like jump out of bed and run to a meeting. Some people that's not ideal. Maybe you want to break it up into a little bit in the morning, a little bit midday, some in the afternoon. If 15 minutes seems outrageously too much time to give to yourself, try with 5. Like just do what you can do. And the more you practice it, I think the more you'll find I really enjoy this. And it can be music, and music can be a very powerful healing practice or energizing practice. So choosing the music that really resonates with you, moving, ceremony, nature, all of these different ways. Body work, oh my goodness, when's the last time y'all had a massage? Massages are really good and really helpful. When we were at MIWRC, we had a massage therapist who came in for the women who were in our programs. And then when she was done, I would say, stick around. There's a few staff members who would like to see you. So we were just added on to her contract and made her available for a couple hours, a couple times a week for staff to just go get a half-an-hour massage. Body work can be so helpful. Reflection, for all of these things. Art, the way you bead, whether you draw, whether you sing, whatever, you are a dancer, whatever you do more of it. Do the things that make you feel good, the things that bring you joy. Commit that much to yourself. So committing to identifying and shaving away negative habits, noticing triggers, noticing when your body is telling you, whoa, I might be in my amygdala right now. Then practicing being in your breath. There's guided imagery. You can do the mountain movement. You can stand on one foot. There's lots of different ways you can immediately get yourself out of that reactive mode. And then there's lots to experiment with. There's apps. I'm not technologically savvy, so I couldn't really advise you on the apps so much, but they're out there. If you Google mindful apps or something like that, you'll find a lot of stuff. You can set timers on your calendar to say, get up and stretch. Like just get up and stretch. Stretch your body, move your body a couple of times a day from your desk. Organizations, leadership counts. If the leadership is not on board, it's really tough to change the culture of the organization to one that values healing engagement. And it takes time. So establishing self-care as a core competency does not negate your accountability to show up. We did a training at one organization a while back on self-care, and like immediately afterwards, people were calling in sick left and right. I need a self-care day. Like half the staff was out. Yeah, okay, but you still got to come to work. Like there's still an accountability piece. So finding the way that you can bake it into the DNA of the organization, as well as how the individual is starting to practice that, is a really nice marriage of skills. Next slide, please. We're almost done. I'll have some time for questions. A couple of books I like. The Body Keeps the Score, actually a really excellent book written by a guy named Bessel van der Kolk, who has the science behind why yoga, Shakespeare, why all these practices can actually restructure the architecture of the brain. So he tells a story of 2 people who were in a car accident, horrible car accident in Canada, man and a woman, same car, same 100-car pileup. And when they did the brain scans on them, the man's brain was just, his affect was flat. He was just, right? He was not engaging. The woman was lit up, like she was just lit up. So 2 individuals in the same experience, totally different responses. But what he was able to do was help both of them use tapping, meditation, yoga to restructure how their brains were moving. And he's proven that you can restructure the brain architecture of children who have experienced extreme trauma. These are ways that don't require them to be on Ritalin, that don't, I mean, some do, so don't get me wrong, I'm not a physician or anything, but some people can benefit from these practices that maybe they don't have to be on medication, or maybe they can reduce medication in concert with their care providers. So a lot of good reading for those of you who have lots of time on your hands. Next slide, please. And then I open the floor for your questions. And there's a lot in the chat, and a lot of it is what brings you joy. So what questions do you have? And Barb, maybe you can help me if there's touch on lateral and cultural. Yes, thank you, Elder June Blue. Lateral, yes, lateral and cultural oppression. This is my experience as well, and I think it is the outcome of centuries of being squashed and oppressed and put down and treated like crap, like all of that. The human body, it's a variation of what I talked about earlier with the thermostat. If your barometer is set high all the time. So I think a lot of people in communities that have experienced centuries of oppression, the way it comes out is those closest to us, our community members, right? So I see lateral and cultural oppression as simply an escape, or it's like a steam valve for people who just need to let something out because they're holding so much in their bodies, right? In their cells. And so the way to begin to unpack that is, it really is through some of these practices, to begin to understand these historic trauma, collective trauma, vicarious, primary trauma, all that impact on our human beingness and how it's showing up, to begin to recognize it first, notice it, and then to really do the deep work of our inner work, our wholeness in whatever ways that people will connect with. And that's why I'm really still trying to get systems to recognize they need to fund this work. I mean, people, we need our elders and our teachers to be much more available. We should have staff positions in schools for elder in residence, like all of that. And people need to pay for that. And the elders should be paid for their work, paid well. Just my little bias. Okay, slides are available. Yes, I think, yes, certainly. I think they are. I'm scrolling down, but Barb, if you see something that you think I should pay attention to.
I haven't, yes, Susie has put in the links to get your slides. So thank you for sharing those with all of us.
Yeah.
Comments on, really like the quote, what are you building?
Hi, David. Hi, David. Yeah, so these are practices that are available to you. Certainly we can spend more time just on the practices. There's a lot to unpack there, but I'm more and more convinced that in our roles today, wherever we are on our journey, that the more we tend to our wholeness and practice our own compassion for ourselves, gratitude for our gifts, for that which we have been given, that we are the ones that will stop the transmission. We are the ones, and we do it now, and we do it every day. And I don't want anyone to feel that you are being, like the burden is on you now. Here's one more thing you ought to do, right? It's not that. It really is an opportunity to pause. I just really encourage you, pause and just breathe. And amazing things come from that. And earlier we heard too, the importance of connection and community, relationship. That is also part of it. So this is why I talk about organizational healing too, because it's important that you're not feeling like you're alone in this work, right? Don Coyes used to talk about the healthy forest, the sick tree in the healthy forest, or this healthy tree in the sick forest. Like you take the sick tree out of a sick forest and heal it and stick it back in the sick forest, it won't do very well. If you take a healthy tree out of a sick forest, like it's, so we have to heal the forest. And that is incumbent on all of us. So each one of us, when we do this work, you will notice people relate to you in a different way. And you will notice your leadership skills are a little more thoughtful and compassionate. Maybe your parenting is a little different. Maybe you don't have as much indigestion. Maybe you're sleeping better. So sometimes the motivation is just, I'm not getting any sleep, right? I'm waking up problem solving at 2 a.m. These practices can begin to help you move through those in a different way. So I am available, happy to talk more. And I thank you all. And look, here we are, talk about spaciousness, 5 minutes early. You know, you have 5 minutes of spaciousness. So let me just say, don't go to your phone. Here's a challenge. Let me put the challenge for you. Don't go to your phone. Take these few minutes that you now have that we're going to be spent listening to me yammer on, and do something really gentle or kind or loving for yourself. Whether it's to step outside, love up a kid or a pet, do some stretching, fix yourself a cup of nice tea, like do something really loving for yourself in the next 5 minutes. I ask that of you. Yes. Okay.
That's so sweet. Thank you, Suzanne.
All right.
One of the things that I do, it's like when I always refer to Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, when we're in our thinking brain, we're here, and when something happens and we're like, whoa, it's hard to remember. Pause. Just breathe. That's for me anyway, just to remember to do that.
Yeah. And it actually becomes a discipline, and you can practice it throughout the day. A really good place to practice breathing is when you're in traffic and you're getting pissed off. Cut me off. Breathe into that, right? That's your amygdala. So those little moments that you can just stop and, oh, I'm just going to breathe into that. There are ways that you can start to build that muscle memory in your body, right? So I see Jeannie is in here. She was my yoga teacher for a while, and I just want to say she is an excellent teacher. So learning different Iyengar yoga was really helpful for me, just in terms of this shoulder thing. Really, like, there's so many good things that can come out of learning some new practices. So I'm glad that you're here, Jeannie, and I'm glad you're all here, and I thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you. So Susie put in, and if you have more questions, great, put them in the chat. Susie put in our next session at 12:30 to 1:15. We're going to do the collaborative coordinator special session. The afternoon sessions start at 1:30 to 2:30. And then please come back for the closing session. It's going to be really cool, 2:45 to 3:30. So those links are in the chat. Again, thank you, Suzanne. Wonderful, wonderful.
Bye. Miigwech.
All right. Thank you.